Okay, we have a problem in society. So 90+%, and I mean, this is pretty, like 5 minutes of research, whatever. So, but apparently 90+%, I've seen as high as 97% suggesting of people do not currently save sex till marriage. So it could be as low as 3% of people who actually do that. And that's a problem. It's especially a problem when you look at the fact that I think I think it's around like 60 or so percent of people in America identify as Christian. So there's a bit of a there's a bit of a disconnect here. A little bit of a disconnect. How is it that I get this the majority of the country that identifies as Christian, and yet somehow this number is like this? Now, of course, I don't know everything about this number, the 90%, because I don't know if it's measuring all generations, just Gen Z, the young generation, whatever. And also, of course, depending on that, how much does the 62% apply to it? If it's talking about Gen Z, well, Gen Z's less Christian than Gen X, so how does that? Well, whatever. Either way, this number is too high, and it's strange that the one of, if not the most infamous rule that Christians follow of saving sex till marriage, or even just that's just a kind of a thing in religions in general, how that actually got to the point where basically even a lot of people who would claim to be following a faith tradition have not been obedient in this way. And of course, I don't necessarily say that to take the moral high ground. One of my favorite parts about the gospel is how well it brings everybody down to the same level, so that preventing anyone from possibly considering themselves to be in a morally superior position. But anyways, I want to talk about this topic a little bit. And specifically talking about what exactly like what the teaching should generally be, and why, maybe a little bit about why it seems that it's being ignored to a certain extent. So I just want to discuss this kind of idea of living together before marriage. I'm going a little bit more broad than just the saving sex till marriage. I kind of want to just discuss kind of what this like where is the line, but of course I'm also going to discuss why chasing the line is a bad idea. So obviously this idea of waiting until marriage before you live together, this is generally going to be found in today's day and age in Christian groups or just religious groups in general, though this is also very traditional. So any tradition or more conservative culture will also probably have these norms. So first I just want to discuss this topic of fornication. So fornication comes from the Greek word porneia, which I wonder what that could mean. Basically, at least in my definition, fornication explicitly means that sexual activity is occurring. It's not necessarily meaning that living together is bad. It's specifically it ensures that sexual activity is actually having. So the other word that I'm going to be using is cohabitation. I'll get into a little bit of that just to compare and contrast, even though the two might be used simultaneously or interchangeably within church rhetoric. But for the sake of this video, I'm defining them as different things. Fornication is going to absolutely imply that sexual activity is happening. And obviously, this is kind of the main word that will be pointed to. Fornication, of course, this is the original Greek. This word's going to use to point that marriage is kind of the magic moment when all of a sudden you do not necessarily have to abstain anymore. Anyway, so first I'm just going to discuss a quick problem. How did we actually get to this point? So the main problem is when it comes to sexual ethics in the church, we oftentimes stereotypically go to the whole homosexuality thing, which yes, it is true that the Bible does condemn homosexual activity. I have a video with maybe one sort of nuance in there, but sexual activity is explicitly wrong in the Bible, both in Old and New Testament. So I don't want to hear any arguments about that. But it also might be you might also hear people say like adultery is bad. The problem with this is that adultery is a very fairly broad term, and it also includes like cheating in a relationship. But it also very much applies here. But the thing is that like oftentimes the rhetoric that's used within church is not necessarily going to attack this issue of fornication or having premarital sex. I'm actually not a huge fan of saying no premarital sex. I prefer to use extramarital sex just to make sure that I'm also including basically any cheating within it. It's obviously more broad, but we're specifically talking about premarital in this particular video here. So I think that for some believers, there's some copes that might be used here. Obviously, as human beings, we love to find excuses to sin, to justify our sin, so that we do not feel the shame and guilt associated with it. This happens with basically anything. I'm guilty of this. Everyone's guilty of this. So first one is first one, if you're engaged, you're basically married, right? You're engaged, right? Yeah, okay. The second one is just like a general committed. So people are just generally committed. Oh, we're committed. We're effectively married. We're not going to break up. Personally, I consider this to be a form of cope. Just because, first of all, both even committed relationships and engagements can be broken off, so you don't know for certain that's actually going to go through. And technically speaking, if you do want to consider that to be marriage, then to break that off could be seen as divorce, which is another touchy subject within the church. And then it's going to be a little bit challenging to do so. I do want to briefly mention, though, that marriage, as defined biblically, is not necessarily the same thing as legal marriage. So I say this to say that I do think it's possible to be considered biblically married without actually being like legally married. The government doesn't really have a say in this or not. But I do still think that like you can't just decide out of the blue one day, oh, we're married or whatever. I think that you do have to make the covenant before God and probably before others. So basically, if you have a wedding, even if the government doesn't know, doesn't like whatever, the government doesn't get involved, then whatever, you're married. But I do think that it does have to be a covenant before God. And if you want to use one of these copes, it's important to note that if you're claiming to be married, then to break this off would also basically be divorce, which basically will probably prevent you from biblically, divorce and breaking off an engagement or something like that oftentimes would not be what, if you want to claim, what am I trying to say? Basically, to break off some of this coping relationship would be seen as divorce, and not always would that be biblical divorce where it's allowed. So it basically just prevent you from being able to biblically pursue marriage in a different relationship is, I guess, what I'm trying to get at. I do want to make a video talking about some of the nuances with divorce, but again, I should also note I'm not a professional theologian. I'm not a teacher or anything like that. I'm just the average Christian who wants to try his best to understand all this stuff. All right, so now let's get to this other word, cohabitation. So so cohabitation explicitly just mean I'm defining in this video as no sexual activity is occurring. The main reason, just to be able to contrast this with fornication, just for the sake of this, though obviously in the church you might oftentimes, like I mentioned, these words could be used interchangeably. Generally speaking, within the church, this cohabitation still has the same stigma as fornication, even if there is no sexual activity occurring. Generally speaking, from churches, you'll still be told no, and I think there is a good reason for that. If I was in a pastoral position, I would probably say the same thing. The main argument that you would hear, which isn't the best one, but it is an argument, which is the whole like risk factor. If you are cohabitating, you are increasing the risk of being tempted in that relationship to actually have extramarital sexual relations, which of course is particularly risky, which is why in a lot of cases that pastors would probably give out the advice to not particularly do that. I think that there might be a little bit of nuance to discuss, and I'll get into that. But yeah, this whole idea, the temptation to sin will go up. Oh, we're perfect, we're special. No, you're not. You're a human being capable of sinning. It is possible to get through that without giving into the temptation. But the thing is, if you're increasing temptation, you might have heard the phrase "give the devil a foothold." Basically, intentionally putting yourself in a position where temptation can increase is not always the wisest idea, even if it's not explicitly sinful. That's kind of what I'm going at. So there's a few issues here. So what does this look like? So roommates. Can you be a roommate with a significant other? Obviously, this is basically the most the closest you can possibly get without having sexual relations. So roommates, Personally, I would generally say um, that this should be avoided. It gets a little bit tricky in some instances, but I'll go quickly through these and then I'll discuss them more. So, like a dorm, I'm mostly saying this like at a college dorm. You're in the same building. Does that count as cohabitation? Generally speaking, I don't really think it does. I do think personally, I'm strongly against co-ed dorms that public schools do. My private Christian school, obviously didn't. They segregated genders by floors, um, which I think that's fine. So I don't really have a problem. I kind of to the extent, but like, what if your neighbors? Is that what it gets a little bit tricky there? Generally speaking, though, I think that in this situation, I don't really care. I think you can get to a point where it is obviously going to increase the risk, but it's not necessarily inherently like wrong to do so. Rooms, what if you're in a different room? You could also define this as staying over at your significant other's house, and staying in a different room, or you can even say like if you're like teenagers, they're staying over at the parents' house, whatever. Again, there's a little bit of nuance here, but generally speaking, I think that there's occasionally, not necessarily the biggest problem in the world, but again, you are going to be increasing the temptation. So this one again kind of has a bit of nuance to it. And then what if you're sharing the same bed? I would generally speaking, I'm going to just outright like um outright out rule this particular thing. This is just temptation is going to be way too high, I think, and at this point, this should be explicitly saved for marriage. But so there obviously is a bit of nuance here, and the thing is that like this whole kind of idea goes to like the concept of the line, right? And here, this is where it gets a little bit difficult because like if you're like here on the line and here on the line, yet you haven't broken the line, and we'll just say on this side it's like you actually commit a sin. Like like effectively there's nothing different here, but the problem is that the closer you get to here, the in theory the stronger the temptation's going to get. So more temptation get you closer and closer. Here, I mean, maybe you go a little close, but like it's not going to be probably as strong. So it's not the wisest thing to do, and this applies to basically any sin. Like it's unwise to try to dance the line, and oftentimes it's hard to define the line, which of course is a challenge in of itself that takes some wisdom. But of course, if you're going to try to dance this line, like that's just generally unwise. And at that point, I'm just like, how committed really are you to following the biblical law if all you're doing is trying to find as close as you can get to the sin without actually doing it? I think that's generally unwise, and and you're intentionally lowering the extent and the seriousness that is the sin, because you're almost playing with it, trying to get as close as you can. So that's why, generally speaking, I would try to avoid cohabitation as much as possible. Until marriage, of course. Fornication is obviously explicitly listed as a sin, that's a duh moment. There's a reason that everybody, even if you're not a believer, knows that that's a rule. Cohabitation, there's a little bit more nuance, but again, you want to try to use wisdom, try to avoid the line as much as possible, get away from the line. Obviously, like, you don't necessarily have to run as far away from the line. Like, farther away as line would be like just avoid relationships in general, which is nothing wrong with. There are people who will live their lives happily single, and that's a good thing. The church needs to stop condemning singles, or treating them worse. That's a topic for another time. Yeah. So this is a problem. We need to try to fix this number. Whatever this number is actually measuring, whether generation, age, whatever, I don't really care. It's too high. We need to try to fix this, and I hope that this sort of rant on this particular subject makes a little bit of sense, that like there needs to be some discussion here, and I think that churches just need to hit this topic hard, because this might be one of the most frequent hidden sins in our current culture, and so I think that we are gonna need to hit it head on.